If you ask players familiar with the history of zombies to go back and think about when exactly the mode really hit its stride and became a phenomenon, most would probably say Riese at the earliest. That map introduced the iconic Pack-a-Punch, the mad Nazi scientist storyline that eventually grew into something much bigger, but that was what most people would say the root of it was, and it introduced a ton more that is really worth a video in and of itself. Personally though, I think a lot of the really important changes to the gameplay that came out of World at War were actually quietly introduced in the map that came out before Riese. That map, of course, was Numa.
Time to amp it up!
Visually, some of the big changes are obvious from the second you load into the map. For the first time in Zombies, you could actually get outside and run around in big open areas. And more than that, the buildings that you could get inside were not the sturdy, concrete, fortified structures of the past couple maps. Instead, they were these rickety wooden structures that honestly didn't look much sturdier than the window boards that you knew the zombies could already tear down. And then beyond that, when you were outside, zombies didn't have to spawn behind a barrier at all. They could just spawn out of the ground, jump over a fence, and be in the playable area. It's obvious that your job is no longer to protect the building. Now it's more that you are given the freedom to roam around the area. It's a subtle change, but it's a change that allowed the designers to start opening maps up and making them more complex. That design change also changes how the player feels. In the previous two maps, when you're trying to balance the tower defense side of the gameplay with actually physically managing the zombies in the claustrophobic indoor spaces, you feel very powerless. And unconsciously in the back of your mind, you're always thinking that inevitably you are going to die soon. Starting with Numa, you no longer feel like every encounter is a last stand. Instead of that continuous sense of dread, you're starting to feel like a capable survivor. It really feels like after Knocked, Zombies' development was split and went in two completely opposite directions. Verrückt doubled down on the horror. It was even more tight and claustrophobic, and as I mentioned in that video, it was a very linear experience with everything in the map driving you to that single goal of turning on power. Numa did basically the exact opposite by opening up the map and letting the player go in any direction basically from the start of the game. It empowered the player, it made them feel strong, and also able to make their own choices. This second take is ultimately the version of Zombies that won that comparison, and most of the following maps would be successful by going down that road of making the characters feel like they had at least some control of how the game plays out, and like you at least had a fighting chance against the zombies for a while. The first big gameplay change that contributed to this new philosophy was the new random perk system. Instead of each perk being in a fixed location on the map, so for example you always knew that double tap was in this one spot, there were 4 arms off the center hub of the map, and at the end of each arm would be a randomly generated perk picked from the options. This leverages a lot of the benefits of the roguelike genre of games. Each game will play a little differently depending on which perks spawn where, and different areas of the map will have different values to you as a player each time. For example, if you don't get Juggernog out of the first 1 or 2 huts you hit, you're spending longer and longer playing a more mobile and overly safe game. If you can't find Speed Cola, you may avoid LMGs and other guns that take a long time to reload. Then, once the perks are revealed, that might change your playstyle from then on out. If you like training zombies by the fishing hut, but Juggernog is in storage on the other side of the map, you might change your strategy to ensure that if you go down, you get revived closer to that valuable perk machine and not have to run through the dangerous center of the map while you're so underpowered. So that's how Numa empowers the player by giving them options and allowing them to make their own choices. The map also literally empowers the player by giving them access to stronger firepower than they've ever had before. The ray gun that's been in the game since the very first map was iconic, but it also had a lot of drawbacks that ultimately made it non-optimal to use. The Wunderwaffe DG2 literally translates to Wonder Weapon, and is the first one that's really deserving of that name. This gun did infinite damage, and the chain lightning would jump to up to 10 adjacent zombies to kill them all basically instantly. There were still the environmental traps around the map that could basically do the same thing, but carrying around this gun made you yourself feel powerful. It didn't feel like you were using the map, it felt like you were doing these things. If you had this gun out, you could be running around the whole map, and as long as you were quick enough, you could get yourself out of a lot of otherwise lethal situations by being able to kill zombies basically instantly and get out of being cornered. Now, this next bit is almost certainly unintentional. I don't think the developers were aiming for this, But Numa is also noticeably less scary than the maps that came before. Being trapped in a claustrophobic ruin of a building is definitely a scarier environment than a fairly wide open outdoor area where you can see the daylight, even though it is still a pretty dangerous looking swamp. I don't think it's impossible to make horror out of that organic, overgrowth kind of environment. I just think they didn't really nail it until Zetsubo no Shima all the way down in Black Ops 3. The early World at War engine was a lot better suited to urban environments, so that's what's a lot more realistic, and that's where a lot of the horror comes from, is that sense of immersion. And having that sense of power due to the new weapon is a big way to cut down on the hopelessness that is another way to generate horror. Of course, that's not to say that there was nothing scary on this map at all. The other big revolution from Numa was the introduction of special zombies and special rounds. This was the map that introduced Hellhounds. So every 5-ish rounds, instead of facing the classic zombies, you would instead be facing the much faster undead dogs. This was the first iteration of boss rounds, a feature that appeared in almost every map going forward. On this one, if you survive the special round, you get rewarded with a guaranteed drop of a max ammo. This was another way that players were given the chance to make their own choices, because especially in those early games like World at War and Black Ops, guns had very little reserve ammo. A lot of the time you could get a gun off the wall or out of the box and use up all of the ammo that came with it within that same round. So, usually, in those early maps, you wouldn't really get the chance to build your perfect loadout. Instead, you'd just hit the box once or twice to get something that was baseline usable and run with that. You weren't fully in control of what you were using. Numa changed that by giving these guaranteed max ammos. Now, you knew for a fact that your ammo would be refilled fairly often, so you could feel empowered to pick a gun that you like, because you knew for a fact that it wouldn't run out of ammo permanently. Still, even though you kind of looked forward to them because they had that reward at the end, at least at the time when those dog rounds started, there was definitely some tension there. They could appear right next to you or behind you with basically no warning. They also ran as fast as you did even when you were at max sprint speed, so you really could not run away from them, you had to stand your ground and fight them as they came. On top of all that, the map visibility went way down as the map got covered with a dense fog. Overall, these dog rounds were a real interlude of tension, followed by a well-earned reward if you did make it through. The last major thing that Numa brought to the table was the very early seeds of the greater Zombies storyline. First and foremost, you had the main 4 playable characters who would go on to become the protagonists of that storyline. Right now, these just served as comically over-the-top stereotypes to add some levity and personality to the game mode. You had Tank being a violence-obsessed American, Nikolai an alcoholic Russian, Takeo a Japanese man obsessed with honor and samurai culture, and Dr. Richtofen, the sociopathic Nazi. Although these were basically just joke characters at the beginning, very slowly, over the course of 5 games, they grew a life of their own, and actually managed to pull off some genuinely emotional moments, especially in the series of Black Ops 3 Easter eggs. Then the other big hint of story that was to come was the Element 115 meteor that you could see just outside the map on the way to storage. Just like the main characters, it didn't really have much context or payoff within this specific map, but it was the very beginning, the seed of an idea. It was slowly explained through hidden radios and voice lines in later maps that exposure to 115 is what creates the zombies, and is what set off basically all the events in this storyline. Side note, in a time where a lot of zombie fiction was going down the road of virus-related explanations for zombies, this was another throwback to classic zombie lore like Night of the Living Dead.
You're coming from a meeting regarding the explosion of the Venus probe, is that right?
Yes, that was the subject of the meeting.
You feel there is a connection between this and the phenomenon?
There's a definite connection.
In other words, you feel that the radiation on the Venus probe is enough to cause these mutations?
There was a very high degree of radiation.
Even though Numa made a lot of revolutionary changes that really shaped the future of Call of Duty Zombies, it gets looked over a lot because it's in a liminal state between the maps that came before it and the one that came after it in World at War. Early on, you had Noct and Verrückt, which were simplistic, but at that point it was so early that we were just happy and surprised we even had zombies. Then right after it came to Riese, which was a masterclass in atmosphere and was just so much bigger and more bombastic than Numa. But in the middle there was this map that, even though it didn't explore all of the ideas to the fullest, it introduced so many core tenets of the mode that would become the pillars that all later maps would be built on.